Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I'm going to be painting a painting of the ocean or some kind of body of water using soft pastels. So this is my reference photo I'm working off of, so you can see the water, just kind of reflective and some sky in the background, nothing too crazy. And I am going to show you a really cool trick when you're just getting started and you're having a hard time picking out what colors you need for your picture. So I pulled up my photo on the Procreate app on my iPad, and then I'm just using the dropper tool and just holding my finger over different areas of the painting and picking out those different colors and then leaving a marking of those colors off to the side on a border. And then those markings that I put on the side, so all the different peaches and grays and things like that I've marked, are going to be a guide for me when I'm picking out what colors I need to use or select for this painting. So I can see what values I need. I can see that I need some peachy pinks, some yellows, teals, navy blues, all that kind of stuff. And this tip doesn't just apply to pastels. You can use it with whatever you're painting, especially if you're trying to do something more realistic. If you are trying to color match something and you are struggling to know what color it is with your acrylics or your watercolor, or know what colors to pull from your colored pencil collection to get started on a painting, it's a good starting point. Now, you might add other colors to it. You might have to mix colors, like even within the pastels, you might have to layer and mix them to get the exact color you want, but it's a really good starting point. And once I picked out all my colors and I got everything set up, I took a pastel pencil and I started sketching in the shape of the water and the sky. That way I could use it as I go along and paint. I like to sketch things out. I know some people are just crazy talented and they just take a pastel and they just go right in. They can form the shapes and all that stuff in their mind. Not me. So I like to do a sketch to work off of. When I'm sketching with pastels, I typically use a new pastel, or I am using a pastel pencil to sketch out my shapes and all that kind of stuff with before I go in with my softer pastels. That's because pastel pencils or new pastels are a lot harder of a pastel. They're more compressed and you get a nice finer point. They don't deposit as much pigment down and you get a little bit more control when you're sketching. But once I had it all sketched out, then I started going in with my more traditional soft pastels and I started blocking in some basic shapes and colors, and then I'm blending them out using rubbing alcohol. The paper I'm working on is pastel matte paper, and it can really handle rubbing alcohol without warping too much. And the nice thing about rubbing alcohol is it evaporates quickly, and so it's a little bit more forgiving on other papers as well than, say, just water. Because you can blend out your pastels using water, but it takes a lot longer to dry, and it can be a little bit harder on your paper. But when you're blending it out, especially on a sanded paper like this, I recommend using an old paintbrush, a golden Taklon one, something that's a little bit more durable, and something that's inexpensive. Because if you use a really nice paintbrush on this, it will get destroyed very quickly and you will be very sad. You don't have to do an underpainting when you're working with pastels. I like to do an underpainting because it allows me to have fun with my picture, or it sets me up for success with how my brain processes information. So if I wanted to do something really fun and colorful, I might paint the sky hot pink and then do little splashes of hot pink in other areas of my painting. And then when I work with pastels, you'll see little sparkles of pastel poking through, and it just creates a really fun dynamic and life to your picture. If I'm trying to do something a little bit more realistic, or especially if I'm doing something hyper realistic and I'm trying to get it as much realism as possible within the piece, then I'll do an underpainting to tone my paper to start getting those values and those colors exactly how I need them to be. And so this one, I'm toning it to be a little bit more realistic. I'm not doing any crazy colors for the underpainting. I'm sticking with the colors that I saw within the painting. This is really helpful because I'm starting to block in where those values are, where I can see where it needs to be darker. And it's also doing that without filling in the tooth of the paper. The tooth of the paper is the texture of your paper. So like a rough press watercolor paper is very bumpy. It has a lot of tooth to it. Sanded paper has a lot more tooth to it. It's just a very even bumpy texture. But the more tooth your paper has, the more layers of pastel it can hold. And if you fill in the tooth of your paper really early on, what happens is you go to put another layer of pastel over the top to add that highlight, and you drag your pastel across the paper and nothing is deposited. It kind of just scrapes off those lower layers, and that's because the tooth of your paper is filled up with other layers and there's nothing left to grab onto your pastel and hold it onto your picture. So by doing an underpainting, using rubbing alcohol, it allows me to do a lot of layers later on. You can see I blended out my pastels using the rubbing alcohol and my paintbrush. I let that dry, and now I'm going in and doing another layer. So I'm adding more of the highlights, some of those pinks and purples that I saw in the sky, and I'm just starting to layer it up. And then I'll blend this with the rubbing alcohol as well. You can do multiple layers of blending with your rubbing alcohol. The more you do it, the muddier it can get. So you don't want to do tons and tons of it, but you can do several layers. And you might notice that I'm only using Unison pastels for this piece, other than the 2 pastel pencils I used for sketching. And that's because I was doing this piece in preparation for a review of the Unison pastels, and I thought it was only fair to do a painting only using this specific brand and to not use inks or other things to supplement it. That way I could get a really good idea of how these pastels work together, how they blend out, how they layer, how they work on pastel matte paper. I messed around with them on other things, and you'll see that in the review. But I stuck with only the Unison pastels, which did affect my color selection. So I did choose a painting subject that used colors that I had quite a few of that would work. But even still, I did not have exact color matches from what I saw in the picture. And that's all right. Most of the time, we're not going to have exact color matches when we're using pastels or colored pencils or any other dry medium. And even if you're using paints, you still have to mix your colors more often than not to get them to be exactly what you want them to be. So you can mix your oil paints to be an exact match for a color within your reference photo, but you still have to mix those colors to get to that point. With colored pencils or pastels, you get as close as you can, but you're going to have to layer colors together. You might have to blend them to get exactly what you want. And if you're working with a limited palette, you might just have to shift subtly the whole undertone of your painting to get it to work with the colors you have on hand. That way you can have a limited palette. You don't have to buy thousands of pastels to get started. You just might have to tweak and adjust your reference photo to work with what you have. So for example, I'm working with a limited palette here. I don't have really good dark blue greens or teal colors to go with my reference photo. And so what I did is I just subtly shifted the whole undertone of my painting to be a little bit more blue than green. And that's okay because it works with the colors I have on hand. It will still be harmonious. The most important thing was that I got the values correct in the colors that I was choosing, and paying attention to the shape of the object or the shape of the shadow or the highlight that I'm painting. Getting the shapes and the direction that I'm laying down the color, that goes a long way, along with getting the values correct. You could paint an apple to be purple and make it super realistic aside from it being purple. But everyone would know that was an apple, because color, the actual color, isn't as important as your values and shape and direction you're painting and all those different things. So just keep that in mind. When you are getting started, it is so easy and tempting to fall for the idea that you need to buy more, that you'll be a better artist if you just have more pastels to choose from or more watercolor colors to choose from. And, you just need to find the paint tube with the perfect skin tone, and then you'll be able to paint people better. And that's a fallacy that new artists fall for. I know I did. A huge portion of the pastels that I actually own were purchased within my first year of getting started with them, because I kind of had this idea that, oh, if I just get this set or these colors, I'll be a better artist. And there was some also depression going on, and so that thrill of opening a new box of colorful pastels was giving me a thrill, and so I purchased way too many during that time. It's just really easy to fall for that mindset. And if you think, oh, if I just find the perfect tube of skin-toned paint, I'll be able to paint portraits better. And that's not how it is. Skin tone has lots of colors within it. And so with my pastels, I find myself limiting my palette all the time. You'll see it in my videos. I will use one specific brand or a specific set from a brand when I am painting, or I will select certain colors that I'm going to work from. Like I'll choose to do a monochromatic painting where I will choose a specific color family and I'll get the whole value scale of that color family. So lights all the way to the darkest darks, and then I will paint a picture just using that. And by putting these limitations on myself, I am becoming a better artist because I have to push myself. I have to think about how I'm going to layer colors to get the color that I'm trying to achieve or the value I want. I have to figure out how I'm going to overcome some kind of limitation I have. It pushes me to think of my supplies in more creative ways and figure out how I'm going to use them. It also makes my paintings more harmonious because I'm not using 1,000 colors. I'm using a limited number of colors and I'm mixing them together to create new ones. And that makes it so all my colors tend to work together, and it makes my picture feel more complete and finished and not as chaotic. So just something to keep in mind. So let's get back to the painting after that lovely tangent and talk about what I'm doing. So I did the 2 sets of underpaintings with the rubbing alcohol, and once that dried, I started working on the sky. I tend to work from the sky forward, or like the top of the painting down when I'm working, because I don't like to paint like a tree and then have to try and block in the sky around it. That's just me. It's not my favorite. So I tend to work background and then I move forward to the foreground, which means typically when you're doing a landscape, you work from the top down to the bottom of your paper. But I started working on the sky, and I'm using different tools to blend. I have a paper stump, so it's just rolled up paper, and I'm blending my pastels with that. And then you'll see me using a tool with a red handle and a silicone end on it. These are clay shapers. They are used a lot in pottery work and clay work to help them get like fine details in their sculpting. And I like them for blending. The paper stump for blending picks up a lot more pigment and smushes it around. And so you get a softer blend with those. You also lose some of the pigment that you deposit. Where the clay shaper, you don't get as soft of blends with it, so you retain some of what you painted, but it just kind of presses the pigment into the paper and gently just kind of slides it a little bit, but you don't get as much pigment pickup. So they both create different textures and looks when blending. And I am just going in and layering these colors and blending them out. Typically what you'll see me do is blend it out like the first layer or two with a blending stump, and then I will do the rubber shaper towards the end because it allows you to keep a little bit more detail. So there's the blending stump, blending that out, getting a softer blend in, and then I'll go over it with the clay shaper. You'll also see me use a big like rectangle tool, and I'll drag that across the paper and blend that way. And that's just like a giant rubber shaper. It's a tool used a lot with acrylic paints. It's kind of like just like a spatula, but it's really good for like big blending of areas. And you can see me moving the clamps around. That's because I don't want to create weird halos on the edges of my painting. So I will move them, paint underneath it, and then put the clips back as needed. But then once I was done with the sky, I started going in to do the water. And I did a lot of back and forth on the water. I find myself doing that a lot with skies and water. I tend to go back and forth and tweak and adjust, just because there's so much subtlety with the lighting that can affect your end result, that I'll do something and I think I'll like it, and I'll come back and I'll be like, that needs to be adjusted. And so there's a lot of back and forth in this picture, and that's okay. Also, I will be frank with you. The first third of this painting was painted a couple hours before I went into labor and had my baby, and the last 2/3 of this painting was painted a couple weeks postpartum. So those two things probably contributed a lot to the back and forth, and because my brain just wasn't fully into art mode. The first third, I really wanted to have a baby, and so I was having a hard time focusing on anything other than why am I still pregnant. And this last 2/3, I would paint for a little bit, and then I would gaze off at my newborn sleeping next to me, and then I'd be like, oh yes, I'm still painting. I need to focus on that. So those two things probably contributed to a lot of the back and forth and the length of this video. But just layering my pastels, more of that back and forth. What I will say is with pastels, they tend to be a lot more like your paints, your acrylic paints or your oil paints, where you tend to start with your darker values first and then put your highlights on top. That's not always the case, but like with this water, I found it was a lot easier to do the darks as my base layer and then do the highlights on top. And I actually went in with the highlights, I would say, too early, and I should have focused more on my darker shadows and then did my highlights. But again, I was a little distracted when I was working. If you are trying to do your own painting of this or something similar, I would say focus on getting your darks dark enough and your midtones in, and then do your highlights at the end. I will say though, the nice thing about Unison Pastels, and I'm not sponsored and this isn't my full review, but they are very, very highly pigmented and they don't have very much filler in them. So what that means is when you are laying down your color, they have a really high color payload. So you can lay down your colors, blend them, and you will keep your color saturation and you'll get really lovely colors. They won't haze out or turn gray or lose their saturation. Some brands that I have worked with, I will go to blend them and like the pigment just completely disappears, or they get kind of mucky. They don't keep their integrity color wise when you go to blend them out, and that's because they've put a lot of filler into their pastels. But the Unison pastels are very, very highly pigmented and they blend really, really nicely. So you can see I'm layering up. I'm adding some greens to my blues to try and get more of that teal green water undertone, but this is going to be a lot more of a blue water, kind of like what we talked about earlier. So now I'm going in with my big blender. This is called a catalyst. It's like a spatula for painting. You can find it in the painting section at most craft stores or online. I really like these catalysts because it allows you to blend out large areas really quickly and to get an even blend on an area. One thing to keep in mind with them is, just like with your pastels, if you have a buildup of pigment on them, when you go to use it, it will deposit that pigment onto your paper. So before you go to use it, just make sure you wipe it off, or in between like swipes and blending sections, you wipe it off. That way you don't get unwanted pigment in areas you don't want. Same with your pastels. If your pastels get really dirty and contaminated with other colors, you want to wipe it off before you start drawing with it, or you'll get like brown in something that you want to have bright yellow or white. So now I'm just going in and adding neutral colors to the water. There's grays in the sky. I'm adding grays to the water. I'm going in and doing like neutral gray greens and purple grays. And the nice thing about adding them and then blending them out a little bit so they're not as vibrant or they don't stand out quite as much is these more neutral tones are going to allow the more vibrant colors to stand out more. It's kind of like if someone's wearing like an all gray outfit and then they have like a hot pink purse or like neon yellow shoes, you're going to notice those vibrant colors because the more neutral tones allow the chroma of those other areas to stand out more. So by adding some more of these gray tones it's going to allow like the pink in these highlights to stand out more and to be a little bit more vibrant and have a little bit more punch. So doing that, I also tend to blend things that I don't want to be the main focus or the star of a painting. When you have like a photo and the thing you want everyone to pay attention on is the part of the photo that's in focus, right? And then everything else is a little bit blurred out. And I'm doing the same thing with this painting. Anything that isn't close or I don't want it to be the main focus, I am blending it out so it's a little bit more blurry. And then I'm saving the crisp lines for the things that I want to sparkle and stand out more. And don't worry if there's stages of your painting where you're like, man, this is looking worse than it did before. I'm making it worse. That's pretty common. Every painting's going to go through an ugly duckling stage and you're going to be like, oh, I just made it worse. But keep at it. If you're getting frustrated, take a break and then come back to your painting. But every painting is going to have an ugly duckling stage and then it will get better and then you'll do another layer and you'll think it's worse. But have faith, keep with it. It will get better. And that's also why I encourage you, like with pastels, to not work with too heavy of layers so that you can always go back and keep tweaking. I really wish I would have had more of this teal color that you see me using, 2 or 3 shades darker, and then another one that was a little bit darker than that. Because that color was the one I really needed a few more shades darker. So you'll see me go back and forth with that one, trying to layer and get kind of the value that I'm wanting. But I mostly had to use navy blues to do that blending because the dark greens I had to choose from, most of them were a lot more yellow greens or like olivey greens instead of blue greens that were dark, and they just didn't layer quite as well as I wanted them to. And now I'm going in and adding my more bright highlights to my water. And this is where having a reference photo to work off of is really, really helpful because you can look at your reference photo and see the subtle nuances within the picture and really help that to help guide your painting. Because if you're just going off of memory, you're going to do it more cartoon-like and not pay attention quite as much to the subtle nuance. So by looking at the reference photo, I noticed that the water on the right-hand side had a higher contrast in the reflection, meaning the highlights were more bright and closer to white in comparison to the colors around it. And the highlights, as they moved left, they lost some of that contrast. They weren't as high contrasting. And that makes sense because that reflects what you see in the sky. My highlights on the right-hand side are closer to white in value. They're very pale blues and very, very light yellows. And then as you move towards the middle, they are more peach and pink in color. I'm using the same colors that I used in the sky. And then as I move towards the left, the highlights in those areas tend to be more grays and blues, but they aren't as close to white on the value scale, so there's less contrast. And now I'm going in and just redefining some of those shadows that you see within the water. That's going to help the water feel more dimensional. And I'm just doing this back and forth process. I'm trying to look at the shape of the shadows I'm seeing. When you're doing something that's really reflective like this, it can be overwhelming because you're like, where do I start? There's so much to do. And I really recommend looking at the shapes, like the generalized shapes that you see. And that's true for any painting. You start with the big shapes and then you work your way in down to doing the smaller and smaller shapes that you see. So I'm looking at the shapes of the shadows. I'm looking at the general shapes of the highlights. Again, it's not going to be a perfect match to my reference photo, but it will be a good guide in helping me know how to paint. And there is a point where you just start looking at your picture and seeing what your individual picture needs. So now I'm just going in and brightening up some of the highlights within the sky. And I'm using a lot brighter of a color. This is pretty much a true white for this part. And I tried to save using my brightest highlights towards the very end to just add that little bit of punch. If you find that your highlight color isn't standing out enough, it means that the colors or the values of the colors next to it need to darken up just a little bit. So if you're using pure white straight out of the tube or a pure white pastel stick and it's not standing out and you're like, I need a whiter white, then what you need to do is adjust the values that are in that area next to it, and that will allow that white to stand out. Same with darks. You just kind of have to pay attention to your values. If you're struggling on knowing what your values need to be or how you need to adjust something, one thing you can do is take a photo of your painting that you're working on and then go in and edit it so that you desaturate it so that it becomes black and white. And that will let you know what areas need to be darkened, what areas need to be brightened, and what midtones need to be adjusted to allow your picture to have the look you're going for. You can also make your reference photo black and white. That way you can compare the values from your reference photo and your painting, because sometimes color can be really distracting, and so by getting rid of the color and just focusing on the value can really help guide you in what you need to do. So now we are just on the final tweaking stages of this painting. So I am just doing the last little bit of adjustments and tweaks to this painting, and I'm just, fine-tuning the blending. And I actually thought I was done at this point, and then I signed it and everything, and then I started editing the video and looking at the photos I had taken of the picture and realized there was a few things I wanted to adjust. And since the painting is still with me because it's in one of my sketchbooks, I couldn't leave it alone and came back into the studio and did the final adjustments because I'm a glutton for punishment. But, as an artist, you're always striving to make your work better each time you do it. And seeing things with fresh eyes lets you see what your picture needs and what adjustments need to be done. So you can see I did a lot of adjustments to the sky. I wanted to kind of warm it up a little bit. I felt like it had gotten too white, even though that sky has more color to it than the reference photo. I felt like warming it up a little bit with some of those other colors will make it more interesting. And then there was some tweaks and adjustments I wanted to do to the water, just getting the shapes of shadows correct and just blending things out just a little bit. And as I finish up this video, please hit the like button if you found this helpful. If there is a topic related to pastels or watercolor you'd like me to cover or something you'd like me to review, please leave it down below in the comments and I will do my best to get to it. And also let me know if you like these longer form videos where they're like 30 minutes or if you want me to condense it down. I've gotten back and forth commentary on it and I'm just interested in seeing what you guys would like. I'm fine doing a 15-minute video or a 10-minute video or a 30-minute video. I just want to create what you guys will find helpful and useful. So let me know. Have a great day. Bye.